constant taker, when generosity becomes a one-way street to exhaustion. First on this critical list, a figure many will recognize, perhaps with a sinking feeling: the constant taker. Their hand is perpetually out. But what happens when your own well of generosity finally runs dry? Gloria, 71, answered her phone. It was her nephew again. His voice, usually a rare sound, now dripped with an urgent need, a small favor that felt anything but small to her weary spirit. 4 years, Gloria had been the family's unwavering go-to. Need a last-minute babysitter? Call Gloria. Dog watching during their vacation? Gloria wouldn't dream of saying no. There was an initial pride in being so needed, a warmth in feeling indispensable. But that warmth had long since cooled, replaced by a slow, painful realization. Her own birthday had passed in profound silence, the phone stubbornly quiet. When illness confined her to bed for a week, no soup arrived, no concerned calls broke the stillness. Gloria would sit alone in her quiet house, the silence amplifying the echoes of her relentless, one-sided giving. The truth struck her with the force of a physical blow. I was a service, not a sister, not an aunt. She was a resource, an endlessly available utility in their lives. The thought of pulling back, of actually saying no, churned a strange guilt within her. A persistent voice whispered that it was selfish, that maybe, just maybe, next time they would finally notice, finally appreciate how much she did. This internal conflict was a constant source of her emotional exhaustion. Her initial willingness to help had morphed into a growing unease, then into the stark, undeniable realization of non-reciprocity. The pattern of these one-sided relationships was clear. Now, she contemplated her dwindling energy. A friend's long-ago advice about pouring water into a cup with a hole at the bottom resonating deeply. It was time to protect what little strength she had left. Takers, after all, don't truly value the person. They value what the person can provide. And as one grows older, personal resources, time, energy, even physical strength are no longer unlimited. Setting boundaries was not just permissible. It was essential for self-preservation. The next time her nephew called, Gloria took a deep breath, the word no forming on her lips for the first time. The silence on the other end was deafening, a prelude to a truth she was finally ready to face. But would this simple word liberate her, or unleash a storm she wasn't prepared for? Gloria's stand was a battle fought against unspoken demands, but not all threats to peace operate so overtly. Some employ a far more insidious weapon of slow, steady erosion, chipping away at the very core of one's being. The chronic critic, weathering the slow erosion of self-worth. Indeed, Gloria's stand was a battle fought against unspoken demands, but not all threats to peace operate so overtly. Some employ a far more insidious weapon, the slow, steady erosion of self-worth, delivered by the chronic critic. Raymond, 82, clutched the loaf of fresh bread, a familiar comfort in his Sunday ritual. Yet, as he approached his cousin's porch, an equally familiar dread tightened his chest. What flaw, he wondered, would be unearthed today? His weekly visits, an attempt to stay connected, had become a gauntlet of subtle, relentless criticisms. Your hair looks different, Raymond. Why on earth did you sell that old chair? It had character. You always take things too personally. Initially, Raymond would offer a wan smile, dismissing the remarks as harmless quirks, perhaps even a misguided form of concern. He told himself it didn't matter. But over years, these small, steady doses of negative criticism had taken their toll. The gradual impact was undeniable. Raymond began to feel smaller in his cousin's presence, his own choices tinged with a new doubt. The simple joy he once felt during these visits faded, replaced by a weary sense of obligation and a creeping anxiety. He noticed he'd stopped sharing his small joys, his new ideas, or any personal news with his cousin, preemptively shielding himself from the inevitable critique. This is the insidious danger of the chronic critic. It's not about loud accusations or overt emotional abuse, but about the quiet daggers of constant disapproval that lead to an erosion of self-trust. Such critics often mask their cruelty as concern, claiming they're just being honest or trying to help you improve, all while chipping away at your peace. Raymond found himself reflecting on how he'd started to brace himself before every conversation. One afternoon, idly listening to a radio program, he overheard a younger psychologist discussing energy vampires, and a spark of painful recognition ignited within him. He began to seriously question if these Sunday visits, meant to foster connection, were worth the significant emotional toll and the diminishing self-worth he experienced. He considered reducing the frequency of his visits, or perhaps suggesting they meet on neutral ground, away from the stage of his cousin's critiques. He knew that in his older age, he had earned the right to feel safe in his own skin, without constantly needing to justify his existence or preferences. Stepping back felt like an act of self-preservation. One Sunday, as his cousin began a familiar critique about a new shirt Raymond was wearing, Raymond felt a new resolve solidify within him. Instead of his usual placating smile or mumbled defense, he simply said, "I actually like it this way." The critic fell silent, a flicker of genuine surprise in his eyes. Had Raymond just found a shield, or merely delayed the next volley? While Raymond found a moment's defense against such overt criticism, some manipulators operate even more subtly, in the shadows of your own conscience, twisting your best intentions against you. The guilt tripper, escaping the heavy cloak of unearned responsibility. While Raymond found a moment's defense against such overt criticism, some manipulators operate even more subtly, in the shadows of your own conscience, twisting your best intentions against you. They don't need to raise their voice. They simply make you the villain in your own story, experts at emotional manipulation. Margaret, 79, stared at her phone, her niece's parting words echoing, "I guess I just thought family would be there for me." The silence that followed the disconnected call was heavier than any argument, thick with unearned guilt. Margaret lived alone and made an effort to stay involved in her extended family's lives. But her niece, it seemed, only called when she needed a favor. This time, genuinely tired, Margaret had gently declined her niece's request for help with a last-minute errand. There was no outburst of anger from the other end, just that disappointed silence, punctuated by those carefully loaded comments designed to make Margaret question her own adequacy, her own selfishness. For the rest of the evening, a crushing weight settled upon her. Was she truly being selfish? The niece's manipulation was subtle, a powerful undercurrent that left Margaret's peace consistently disturbed. This is the hallmark of the guilt tripper. They expertly twist situations, often using your best qualities, your loyalty, your empathy, your sense of duty, against you. Margaret found herself constantly apologizing, over-explaining her reasons, often giving in just to avoid the dreaded cold shoulder that inevitably followed any attempt at setting boundaries. She began to dread her niece's calls, each ring a potential summons to another round of emotional manipulation where she was subtly cast as the villain. It became clear that this was not an expression of love or familial connection. It was leverage. The unspoken message was that she owed them her compliance, her energy, her peace, and that failing to provide it was a moral failing on her part. One afternoon, while tidying a bookshelf, Margaret stumbled upon an old journal from her youth. An entry described a manipulative childhood friend whose tactics now seemed chillingly familiar. The pattern clicked into place with a startling clarity. "This isn't about her needs," Margaret whispered to the quiet room, a newfound resolve hardening her voice. "It's about my compliance." She decided then and there that her heart was not a doormat. Her self-respect demanded she recognize these guilt-inducing tactics for what they were. The next time, she would state her no calmly and without lengthy, apologetic explanations, refusing to engage with the ensuing emotional blackmail. The phone rang again weeks later. It was her niece, another urgent request. Margaret stated her refusal kindly but firmly. "Oh," was the clipped reply, followed by a sigh designed to inflict maximum guilt. Margaret held her breath, waiting for the usual wave of remorse. But what if this time, something inside her didn't break? Margaret was beginning to unburden herself from the heavy cloak of unearned guilt. But what about those whose undermining tactics are even more insidiously cloaked in the guise of supposed friendship? The secret competitor, when friendship hides a silent rivalry. Margaret was beginning to unburden herself from the heavy cloak of unearned guilt, but her struggle highlighted a chilling truth. Not all undermining tactics are as direct as overt demands or explicit criticism. What about those whose maneuvers are even more insidiously cloaked in the guise of supposed friendship? These are the quiet saboteurs, the secret competitors. Your piece is interesting, Helen. Very bold for your age, Judy said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Helen, 76, felt a familiar chill despite the warm art studio. After years of putting her creativity on hold, she had nervously but proudly joined a local art class. Her longtime friend Judy had joined too, professing a desire to support her. Yet, week after week, Judy found subtle ways to undercut Helen's efforts. Comments like, "I love how carefree yours looks. I guess technique isn't everything," were delivered with an air of friendly advice. But they chipped away at Helen's burgeoning self-confidence. She started to wonder if she truly belonged there, her initial excitement for the class slowly diminishing. Helen began to notice a pattern. Judy always seemed to have a slightly better story to tell, a more exciting trip planned, or a bigger compliment received from someone they both knew. Around Judy, Helen never felt fully celebrated, merely tolerated, or worse, subtly minimized. She found herself dimming her own light, hesitant to share her small successes in the class for fear of Judy's backhanded compliments or inevitable one-upmanship. This is the insidious nature of the secret competitor. They don't attack directly but use comparison like a scalpel, quiet, sharp, and hard to trace. It's a debilitating form of rivalry disguised as closeness. Such false friends don't want you to shine too brightly beside them. One afternoon, Helen observed Judy's fleeting but unmistakable shadow of envy when another classmate received high praise from the instructor. Later that week, while sorting through old boxes, Helen found a photograph of herself and Judy as young women. In it, Judy wore the exact same envious expression as Helen proudly held a small local award. The pattern, she realized with a jolt, had always been there, unseen for decades. This wasn't supportive friendship. It was a quiet war she had never enlisted for, a constant, undermining jealousy. In older age, energy is too precious for such competition. Helen decided then to focus on her own joy in art, irrespective of Judy's subtle digs, and perhaps seek out new, genuinely supportive relationships within the class, connections that felt like a warm fire, not a cold scoreboard. At the next class showcase, Helen displayed her boldest piece yet. When Judy approached, Helen met her gaze steadily, a newfound confidence radiating from her. "I'm quite proud of this one," Helen stated simply, offering no room for a veiled critique. Judy's smile faltered. Was this the end of the unspoken game, or just a new, more open battlefield? Helen chose to shine despite the shade thrown by a rival. But the final figure on our list is perhaps the most insidious, a master of implication and the unspoken. The passive-aggressive manipulator, decoding silence, sarcasm, and subtle sabotage. Helen chose to shine despite the shade thrown by a rival, a testament to reclaiming one's joy. But the final figure on our list is perhaps the most insidious, a true master of implication and the unspoken, the passive-aggressive manipulator, whose emotional games can quietly exhaust your spirit. Guess you're finally slowing down. Huh, Harold? Doug chuckled, waving dismissively as Harold, 83, struggled with a heavy planter. The smile didn't match the sting of the words. Harold had lived in the same neighborhood for decades, and his neighbor Doug was always superficially friendly, quick with a wave and a seemingly jovial remark. But when Harold, an independent man, occasionally needed a small bit of help, like moving that planter or lifting a heavy box, Doug's assistance, if offered at all, came wrapped in jokes with a barb. "I'd offer, Harold, but I've got 2 knees that still work, and I'd like to keep them that way," he'd say, another chuckle. Harold would be left standing there, unsure if he'd been subtly insulted or merely dismissed with thoughtless humor. This was the art of silence, sarcasm, and subtle digs that this type of manipulator excels at. There was the incident where Doug conveniently forgot to relay an important message about a neighborhood meeting where Harold was due to speak, causing Harold to miss it entirely. Doug's subsequent apology was profuse, yet it felt hollow, leaving Harold to wonder if it was a genuine lapse or a calculated oversight. Such passive-aggressive manipulators avoid direct responsibility, often pretending they didn't mean what they said, or worse, flipping the script to accuse you of being too sensitive or dramatic if you dare to bring it up. Over time, Harold found himself walking on eggshells around Doug, avoiding asking for anything, noticing how messages might go unanswered or shared activities would be canceled last minute with flimsy excuses. He began to silence his own needs just to keep a peace that felt increasingly false and draining, a counterfeit kindness that cost him his own tranquility. This behavior, often slipping under the radar, is exhausting. After the planter incident, Harold sat on his porch, reflecting. He realized the peace with Doug was entirely on Doug's terms, maintained by Harold's own silence and compliance. At his age, peace wasn't a luxury, it was a requirement. "I'm too old for these games," he murmured to himself. He decided then that he would no longer engage with the subtle digs or try to decode Doug's ambiguous behavior. He would remain civil, of course, but he would create an emotional distance, reclaiming his own quiet. The following week, Doug saw Harold installing a new, lighter planter by himself. "Need a young man's strength for that, Harold?" Doug called out, his usual smirk in place. Harold simply smiled, waved, and continued his work, offering no verbal response, no opening for further emotional games. Doug stood there, momentarily flustered by the lack of expected engagement. Was this the beginning of Harold truly reclaiming his space? And what would Doug do when his usual tactics failed? From the overt demands of the taker to the subtle barbs of the passive-aggressive, we've seen how easily peace can be fractured. Now, let's gather these threads and consider the most profound act of kindness. The one you offer yourself. Your golden years, your rules. The ultimate kindness is to yourself. From the overt demands of the taker to the subtle barbs of the passive-aggressive, we've seen how easily peace can be fractured by those who should uplift us. Gloria, Raymond, Margaret, Helen, Harold, their stories echo in many lives, perhaps in yours. Do you recognize reflections of these figures in your own circle? Are you, too, unknowingly offering your precious reserves of time and energy to those who only deplete, who only take without return? Understand this. In your later years, peace isn't a luxury. It is a hard-won, precious sanctuary. You've likely carried others, forgiven more than was perhaps wise, and stayed silent too often merely to keep a false peace. No more. These golden years are not for enduring toxic relationships or draining patterns. They are for actively clearing them out, for protecting what you've earned. You have the sovereign right to safeguard your space, your heart, and your invaluable time, setting boundaries with unwavering resolve. True kindness, in this vital chapter of life, must be redefined. It is compassion intertwined with firm boundaries. It is warmth dispensed with wisdom. If this means walking away from someone who has been a fixture in your life for years, let their departure be the sound of your liberation, not a testament to your failure. Sometimes, the greatest, most profound act of self-kindness is the one you finally give yourself by looking in the mirror and declaring, "Enough." So, take a moment to reflect on these insights. Choose, with intention, to stop handing pieces of yourself to people who never offer anything back. Your later years are not merely for surviving. They are for healing, for growing, and for surrounding yourself with souls who genuinely see you, who cherish you, who add to your light. And that profound, empowering shift begins with the brave, quiet act of letting go of those who never truly did. This is your time to flourish in peace.